please.
Okay, thanks a lot, Safka, and thanks to all for invitation. It's actually a pleasure to start that series of nice seminars. So as Safka mentioned, I have a pretty long title, and I actually extended it a bit by adding or spice it up by basically writing here and machine learning, because it's in fact the case for the very last part of the presentation. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors here, friends, Patricia Martinez-Garzon, with whom I collaborated for many years here, as well as with Marco Bonhoff and Georg Dresen, and with Sadegh Karimpouli, who is our machine learning experts. And this presentation also includes a lot of contributions from the people I directly collaborated with, namely Maria Leonhardt, Stefan Benz, Lei Wang, Joanna Holmgren, recently Jason Gigoratos, also Jörn Davidsen. And also I would like to acknowledge companies and teams that basically contributed to this very interesting data set that I'll be speaking in the first part of the presentation, namely ST1 Deep Heat or ST1 OI from Finland, FastLock, ACER, Arup Geohazards, and University of Helsinki. Okay, so let me start the presentation. So with this very general slide that basically says that the seismicity related to fluid injection, you know it very well, have seriously affected or even terminated some EGS projects. I mean, with the part, you are possibly well aware of the case study of Basel in Switzerland, but also recently Pohang in South Korea. I hope that you see my pointer, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I just make it maybe. Okay, so from that perspective, the implementation of safe stimulation strategies is critical for the public acceptance of, well, pending and future EGS projects. So, I mean, this talk will be about characterizing the seismomechanical reservoir state and its potential for transition from stable to runaway conditions using machine learning and physics-informed features. So I'll be very often using the word like stable and unstable seismic response. So I just want to define it maybe here. So by stable seismic response, I mean then the induced earthquakes sizes are always maintained within the limits of stable rupture propagation. So in other words, they basically follow the existing models of maximum magnitude. They don't exceed the limits on this maximum magnitude. And in addition, the maximum magnitude or seismic moment release is visibly following the technological parameter. So this is in contradiction to what I would call unstable or runaway seismic response, in which earthquake magnitudes are at odds with existing models and ruptures are effectively unbound. Well, they are driven possibly by the tectonic stress conditions rather than injection operations. So I will start with this particularly nice case of the ST1 Deep Heat project in Helsinki, at least from the perspective of seismic hazards. So this is, for those that don't know, this was the world's deepest EGS system that is composed of the well doublet OTN2 and OTN3 wells, reaching 6-kilometer depths, and ultimately the project was aiming to provide a sustainable baseload for the local area heating network. So the site operator, ST1, took actually past experiences of shutdown of some geothermal projects really seriously. So they established a very good seismic monitoring network that was aiming to maximize event detectability and enable the near real-time processing of seismic data. So the traffic light system was designed for the site, and essentially any event with magnitude larger than 1.2 would have been to be reported within, let's say, 20 minutes to the local municipality and actually trigger the assessment on rejection operations. And if there would be a magnitude 2.1 or larger event, that would lead to the immediate project stop and shut down of the entire project. So it was actually a key to basically perform a near real-time processing of this data. Actually, in the second stimulation that was performed in 2020, it was fully supported by machine learning and fully automated. Basically, we track the evolution of seismic activity. We warn on the critical events via the dedicated website. We have mobile phones, and that was used to control let's say, the pumping operations. So as for the stimulations, we had 2 stimulation campaigns at this site. In 2018, there was a massive stimulation in OTN3 well. There was 8,500 cubic meters injected at very high wellhead pressures, reaching 90-something megapascals to create the reservoir around this well. And in the 2020, there was another stimulation in OTN2 well to establish the communication between the 2 wells. Here, there was actually much less fluids injected, and there was also much smaller seismic response. The maximum magnitude that was reached was 1.8, which was basically obviously below the red alert system, below the red alert threshold, sorry. And there was quite a lot of amber events detected and processed during the stimulation campaigns. So I will already kind of set up what are the factors that contributed in our perspective to the successful control of the seismicity and maximum magnitude in that reservoir. So over the last years, we explored a lot of these factors with many colleagues, and we also recently started to employ the laboratory experiments on rock samples to investigate that. So the first thing is, the key element is an adaptive injection strategy, which is guided by the near-realtime seismic monitoring. The second element that contributes to the stable seismic energy release is a favorable structural inventory and tectonic stress conditions. And finally, the third component is the lack of significant stress transfer and overall limited stress perturbation. So I will start with this first element, adaptive injection strategy. So we had this very good near real-time seismic monitoring in place, and that allows us to essentially track the seismic response at high resolution right from the very beginning of the stimulation. So this chart shows the evolution of hydraulic energy and cumulative radiated energy in the first phase of the stimulation that lasted, as far as I remember, 10 days. So it was quickly realized by the project team that the seismic energy release is essentially proportional to the hydraulic energy. And well, any stop in injection operations leads to a quick decrease in the seismic activity. So in the second phase of the injection, which was lasting from day, I think, 12 to 22nd, that was performed at the basically highest possible injection rates and pressures, and that led, at least from the observational point of view, to the acceleration of seismic moment release and occurrence of the couple of large events in amber, let's say, a level that temporarily put the stimulation on hold, this phase of stimulation on hold. So at this moment, I think the project team realized that the maximum magnitude evolution increases with the cumulative fluid volume, with the trend that actually followed the recent at the time published model of maximum magnitude by Gallis et al. So by quite naively expanding or extending that trend to the target volume that was supposed to be 20,000 cubic meters, there was a fear in the project team. You see the concerned scientists here. Yeah, that basically by the end of the injection, the red alert will be exceeded. So if we go to the model of Gallis, that provides the maximum magnitude of so-called arrested ruptures. And the magnitude depends on essentially on the amount of energy that is available, that is stored for rupture propagation and underground. So in our case, this is depending on the hydraulic energy input. So the project team decided to reduce the amount of this energy that is stored in the system somehow. So that was actually done in 2 steps. So in the first step, the team basically decided to decrease the wellhead pressure and to the values below the 90 megapascal. That was not, as far as I remember, that was not pretty successful. So in the following, the injection plan was changed. And that means that they started to progressively reduce the injection times and enhance the resting periods in between the successive stimulations. So this stabilized the energy release at the different level, and till the end of the project, the red alert threshold was not exceeded and effectively kind of maximum magnitude capped at certain value, which was around magnitude 1.8. So actually, if you go to the laboratory now for a short moment, there is a laboratory analog experiment for that. So you basically have an intact sample. Here is actually damage already sample, but you can imagine that we have an intact sample, and we load that intact sample in the triaxial conditions to ultimately produce the shear failure. And at the same time, we monitor the seismic activity using acoustic emission sensors. So basically, we monitor tiny, tiny earthquakes in that sample, and we provide the feedback to the loading by basically counting how much this activity is increasing. So if we have obviously high activity, what we want to do is to reduce the loading. And in this way, it was shown that you can actually prolong the inelastic deformation in the sample for much longer time, and the damage of the fault zone or the damage in the future fault zone will still progress. And this is indicated here with this dropping down ultrasonic velocities that are measuring the damage basically in the sample, and basically prolong that kind of failure or basically the inelastic deformation until the final failure. So, well, in the field, actually this stable behavior or pressure control evolution is the case for many reservoirs. So Stefan Benz from our team analyzed multiple studies, and he showed that for many sites, the proportion between the hydraulic deformation, like let's hear this shown, like the cumulative volume of fluid injected, and the seismic deformation is kind of constant, at least for the significant portion of the injection. However, for some sites, this deformation is actually continuously increasing. And it is moreover, what's actually moreover important is that is at odds with any existing models of maximum magnitude or seismic moment release. So basically that would be the way so if we observe some kind of deviation from seismic energy release with respect to the hydraulic energy, that should possibly trigger some warning for us, but I will come to that in a bit later. Regarding favorable structural settings and tectonic stress conditions, what we actually found is that, first of all, you can see it already from the distribution of the seismicity, that the hypocenters and their precision provides no evidence whatsoever for alignment of the seismicity along any larger structure. So instead, that clouds of the seismicity suggest that the seismicity occurs in the zones of distributed fractures. And this is actually supported by the damage intervals that were identified in the well logs that spatially intersects with the seismicity clusters, and actually that coincides a bit with the highlight lithology. So another hint for the favorable structural conditions comes from the magnitude frequency distribution. So basically, there is a statistically significant roll-off of the magnitude starting around magnitude 1.5. Well, that suggests that there is an upper limit to the fault sizes, maybe, so in the sense of the maybe geometrical limitations, or in the sense of the fault strengths. And that is pretty ambiguous what is the reason, but the size of the clouds are way larger than the sizes of the largest events here. So possibly it's the damage zone are essentially, that's not a geometrical constraint that is possibly playing a major role. So if you combine the hypocenter locations together with the focal mechanisms, that indicate us that we basically, or the stimulation activated a network of subparallel fractures that are mostly favorably oriented with respect to the stress field. And this is obviously a fundamentally different scenario than injection into the prominent fault. So such structural inventory is promoting dissipation of hydraulic energy on small fractures that likely inhibits the stress transfer or stress perturbation as proposed by Schönball in 2012 for Schultz already, and finally limit the propensity for the runaway ruptures. Now we go to the third element, which is essentially limited stress perturbation and stress transfer. So there was a couple of studies that we performed recently on that topic, and first is the directivity study that was made by Joanna Holmgren, and we essentially investigated the directivity of the largest events from 2018 stimulation, and we found that the directivity of most earthquakes is well parallel and generally along the slip direction. So that means that the earthquake ruptures are, well, generally confined to the pore pressure perturbed zone, which is expanding, in our case, mostly horizontally, and follows the, well, roughly it follows the diffusion law. So there is, in addition, there is no evidence that fluid injection-related stresses drives the earthquake directivity, because as it would be like if we would follow the logic of Dempsey and Sakale, that if there's a stress gradient, if there's a high stress gradient related to fluid injection, so that would actually promote the directivity towards the injection, so towards the well. This is not happening here. Neither we observe the directivity outside of the reservoir, except for the one single event that could be driven by the tectonic stresses. Another thing is that we have a relatively the temporal evolution of the Gutenberg-Stell B-value is quite minor. It's typically within the uncertainties of the B-value estimations. So it can be considered quasi, let's say, stationary. So if we follow the seminal work of Scholz here, that time invariance of the B-value would suggest that there's a limited changes in the stress level at the reservoir depths. Alternatively, you can also follow the more, let's say, structural approach of the Ian Main, where the B-value time invariance would suggest that there's a stable development of the fracture network. For example, like lack of progressing fracture coalescence. So from the perspective of seismic hazard, or effectively, we have a clear indication that the hazard is controlled by the seismic activity level. Well, so accordingly, the hydraulic energy rate. And the last ingredient for the stability is lack of significant stress transfer. So this analysis can be performed with the classical techniques, namely Coulomb stress transfer, but we actually faced a lot of difficulties to apply that, simply because of uncertainties in location and focal mechanisms prohibited us from making some kind of inference from that analysis. So we focus on the simple statistical proxies for the stress transfer and earthquake interaction, and we essentially tested whether the seismicity is passively responding to injection. That can be described with a non-stationary Poissonian process in time-space, or whether it's clustering, suggesting interaction between events. So in case of the ST1 reservoir, we use Bayesian Paczewski metrics to separate the catalog into background and cluster seismicity, and we found that only 12% at most of the events are displaying clustering properties. So this is significantly lower than is observed for the tectonic sequences, and suggests to us that there's actually minor interactions between events and limited stress transfer. Likewise, we tested other statistics, and we found that inter-event times and magnitude distribution in time follow what is expected from quasi-stationary Poissonian process. So as for the inter-event time ratio, basically the occurrence of events in time is following the Poissonian process. And in case of the magnitude correlation, the sequence of magnitudes is behaving like, so the magnitudes are, sequence in magnitudes is behaving like randomly drawn from the Gutenberg-Stell distribution. So to summarize that part, what we believe about the ST1 Helsinki and its seismicity is that the seismicity is simply stable because it's responding solely to injection operations in favorable structural and stress condition settings. And that essentially means that, well, the seismic activity and the max aren't governed only by the hydraulic energy rate. The seismicity follows quasi-stationary Poissonian process with no significant interaction and stress transfer. Overall, there is a low potential for making it unstable unless we could hit something. But basically, there is no larger faults here, and the injection is performed into the 3D distributed network of small fractures. So Patricia actually had a nice study that actually summarize what we think about the reservoirs that are having a low potential or high potential for generating the runaway ruptures. So I will not discuss it in details because I will continue with the parameters in the next slides. But anyway, if you are interested, please go for the paper in Leading Edge. That pretty nicely summarized it. So conceptually, what we want to do is to, I think now, identify approach to the using the near real-time monitoring, and we want to identify the approach to the critical state of this geothermal reservoir in terms of the seismic hazard. And what we believe is that we have to basically incorporate many features all together in a machine learning framework. So that features needs to possibly track the potential deviation of the seismic energy release from that predicted by existing models, deterministic or statistical models of the stable rupture propagation at a very high resolution. These parameters needs to provide continuous information on the development or unexpected development in the structural inventory of the reservoir, for example, that we are hitting or we are approaching the fault. And finally, they should inform in ample time on earthquake interactions that could emerge from this fault, approaching the fault, or from any unexpected acceleration in the seismic process. So I mentioned already that that to combine all these various features, we try to implement the machine learning here. And I'm going now quickly through the parameters that we want to use. So that's a recap again. So first of all, we would like to explore this fact that the evolution of seismic moment and maximum magnitude is at odds with existing models. And that effectively means, this is again the slide from study of Benz et al., that the partitioning of the radiated to hydraulic energy is changing with time. And this is actually visible for some data sets, like for example, Cooper Basin here or Pohang. So that's actually a very kind of dangerous situation because the seismic efficiency or seismic injection efficiency is increasing rapidly, even if you inject a lot of fluids. So this is way worse situation, or what we are expecting to have for the stable reservoir is to have the constant or maybe decreasing value. This is the most safe approaches, and in general, the lower value here, the better. So anyway, changing in partitioning of this radiated to hydraulic energy must trigger warning, and that's one of the potential parameters that you can track. But actually, there is many more. There is a similar parameter, the Shapiro's seismogenic index, or for example, seismic efficiency factor of halo. As for the structural parameters, the structural settings parameters development, we could employ parameters describing the geometry of the hypocenters through the fractal dimension or correlation integral. We could describe the fracture heterogeneities by comparing neighborhooding focal mechanisms to see, for example, using the Kagan angle, and for example, see if the fractures are aligning, which would suggest that we are maybe hitting some major structure. Finally, we can also track the statistical properties here, like the b-valued spatial temporal evolution, or for example, deviation from of the distribution from the self-similar behavior. As for the parameters characterizing earthquake clustering and earthquake interactions and stress transfer, so the idea is to basically detect the deviations from some quasi-stationary processes in time, space, or magnitude domain. So actually, Bayesian-Paczewski metrics provides a kind of convenient way to, and largely unsupervised method that can be automatized to separate the data into the background and cluster seismicity. And then we can further characterize the clustered families of events in space-time magnitude domain. So other statistics I already mentioned, they involve the specific dimension. For example, the magnitude correlations would allow us to kind of identify local in-time accelerations of the accelerations in the seismic process. So ultimately, the goal is to combine these parameters from these three pools, fit the machine learning model with an intention to identify the system state, maybe forecast the system state, or occurrence of the runaway events. And this is quite difficult at the moment for the geothermal data. simply because that requires a lot of data for training. So we decided to start or shift our attention to laboratory experiments, which provide controlled conditions and enable us to train and machine learning models, but more importantly, it allows us to optimize the feature pool and understand the feature pool of the parameters that we are aiming to use. So one thing that we are, I think, trying to attempt is to have a cross-scale framework. So the developed methodology as well as the parameters describe this EGS state must be cross-scale. In other words, they should be possible to apply them in laboratory experiments, in underground laboratories, to the large scales of EGS projects. So so we have seen that this stimulated fracture networks at ST1 are possibly quite complex. They are distributed network of small fractures. So we saw that the good starting example here in the laboratory scale would be naturally fractured fault, like it is shown here. That's like centimeters here, which could be considered a first order approximation of the fault network surrounding the principal fault zone. So we decided to use the laboratory stick-slip experiments on the pre-fractured heterogeneous fault and essentially investigate whether we are able to capture the deviation from this stable deformation towards the critical state that ultimately ends in an occurrence of the system-side runaway event. So the stick-slip experiments itself, for those that don't know, are an analog of earthquake cycle, where you basically load the pre-existing fault, and that results in a periodic repetitive violent slip on the fault surface. So they're actually shown here with the large stress drops in the axial stress data. So we have the pre-fractured granite sample here that contains this contains the rough fault. And the sample is subjected to the fractional stress state, and the loading is performed actually at constant deformation rate, and that leads to the episodic slips of the entire fault surface. And the seismicity itself is monitored with the network of 16 acoustic emission sensors that are glued directly to the surface of the sample and provide the optimum coverage. So during the experiment, this acquisition system is mostly working in passive mode. It records the acoustic emission activity. You have an example of the magnitude -8 even here, I think. And it allows us to basically develop a seismic catalog that includes the location, magnitude, but also we can perform the full moment tensor inversion. So additionally, we have the active measurements, P-wave velocity measurements. They are not used here in the study, but they are used here for us to characterize the damage in the sample and develop the 1D velocity model for location of acoustic emission events. So coming to the study itself, so the preparatory processes, or before that runaway earthquake, the large runaway earthquake, were tracked with an ensemble of 16 unique seismomechanical and statistical parameters. These parameters were derived as a time series from acoustic emission catalog containing 800,000 acoustic emission events and 120,000 full moment tensors. And I mentioned a lot of these parameters already, so they included basic statistical properties such as acoustic emission rates or seismicity rates, B-value, fractal dimension, correlation integral, a lot of measures derived from localization and clustering. From the focal mechanisms, we actually calculated, we analyzed the evolution of the focal mechanism in time and how they vary to indicate some kind of alignments in the focal mechanisms. And finally, what is pretty novel, we also performed the stress inversion of acoustic emission focal mechanisms, and from that we derive the measures for local stress orientation, variability, and rotation in time. So I will not go into details of these parameters, you can imagine, because we would possibly lose another hour on that. So I will just straight go to the results here. So I think that early in this analysis, we realized that our parameters pool respond to roughness development occurring at different length scales. So, well, that is obviously the reflectance of the fact that we have a complex fault zone. So what we identify here is that we have a sub-millimeter grain scale roughness development that is actually well picked by the temporal evolution of source parameters of individual acoustic emission events. We have also what we call asperity scale roughness that is best described by the, let's say, collective properties of the acoustic emission events in time and space. And finally, we have the sample scale roughness that is characterizing the development of this like a long length scale global relief. And that is picked up very well by the collective properties of acoustic emission that are measured in, let's say, time windows. And this is typically corresponding to the more than centimeter scale roughness. So coming to the results, this continuous loading of the sample with such complex fault led to the corresponding complex slip pattern. And this is revealed actually in the external stress measurements, as well as in the acoustic emission monitoring. So here you have basically the snapshots or the animation of the acoustic emission activity, and you see where we are in the cycle. So you see actually how the sample is responding to the loading. So we have the large lap quakes you already mentioned, like runaway. Let's say they are corresponding to the runaway events. So they are represented with large stress drops and the slip over the whole fault surface here. And these are preceded with the complex, this spatial temporal patterns of acoustic emissions that overall well indicate it's a truism, a roughness and stress evolution at a different range of scales. So yeah, so that's how it looks like, and it looks, as you can see, it looks pretty complex here. And then complexity is as well reproduced by the source parameters, by the parameters that we calculated. So, for example, we basically see the multiple episodes of acceleration and deceleration in the seismic activity, some awkward evolutions of the b-value, and so on and so on. So this is the first slide with the machine learning. So we basically perform the unsupervised clustering using k-means approach, and we ask the machine learning system to divide the data into 3 clusters that we later called stable, unstable, stable, and transitional, and unstable or critical. And the outcome of the classification here is shown on the top picture that is overprinted on the actual stress data. So obviously the actual stress data was not a part of the input. That would be too easy then to classify. So, I mean, overall, the unsupervised system was capable to identify the high resolution information on the mechanical state of the fault only from this acoustic emission data. And that's actually quite important because this acoustic emission data constitute of less than 1% of the external strain that is applied. So what we see here, we have these numerous transient critical states that are highlighted with the red color, more or less, that predominantly occur at the high level of stress. And this machine learning identified critical states mostly precede failures of millimeter to centimeter scale asperities in the sample. So a deeper analysis, let's say causal analysis between the asperities, show that basically there is some, likely there is some stress transfer related to the occurrence of these asperities, and that somehow enabled the occurrence of the large earthquake. But I will just go to that in details in the next slide. So what is happening in that complex fault zone is believed conforms to the what is called intermittent criticality framework. So first of all, what we see in the evolution of the parameters is that the parameters that we discuss show saturation, fluctuation, or well, generally an erratic behavior at the high level of stress. So this is also the critical stage of the complex fault system in which this fault is basically continuously approaching and retreating from failure. And these retreats, in our case, are caused by the microslips from, let's say, millimeter to centimeter scale, which is essentially failures of the asperities. So if we look into that evolution of that asperities, and here an example of 3 snapshots that are close in time, happening somewhere here in the cycle. Yes, let's CSE1, see this is here. So essentially what is happening here is we have the first asperity failure and the seismic activity is dropping down here. So the stress is relaxed from that part, but possibly there is a stress transfer to the surrounding regions. And actually the next failure occurs just in an adjacent patch here. And then the following patch that is activated is crossing diagonally through the nearly, well, it's a kind of patch that crosses nearly the whole surface, but diagonally and also in a limited region. So ultimately, what we believe is happening here is that basically each failure of this patch smoothes out the longer and longer length case of the stress field. And ultimately, we reach the situation in which some, well, let's call it random stress perturbation somewhere in that sample that is well placed with respect to that patch that is smooth out, will allow for the large event, runaway event, to propagate over the smooth portion of the stress field. We also, as you can imagine, investigated the time to runaway earthquake. And for that purpose, Sadegh used the ensemble of LSTM networks and actually use our 16 independent parameters that will actually define. I forgot to mention this. We have like 47 features because we use different time windows. And essentially, we found that the machine learning is well capable to forecast in a rough way the occurrence of the large lap quake, but the generalization of this forecasting is actually heavily conditioned on the amount of the training data, and this is simply because well, first of all, we don't have enough data, and secondly, this is simply because of the complexity of the fault surface. So we are not covering possibly all the cases to train the LSTM network efficiently. So that was actually a side work here because we actually were more interested in feature importance and feature optimization. So we basically could find out which features are the most important for the time to failure prediction. But we also identify actually that even if the feature is not highly correlated with the time to large earthquake, large runaway earthquake, it may still efficiently contribute to the forecast, to the improvement of the forecasting accuracy. And there's a kind of nice example here from this is a parameter that is fault plane variability. It basically describes the complexity of the focal mechanisms of the neighborhooding couple mechanism. This feature is really badly correlated with time to failure, but its importance for the time to failure prediction is pretty high. So this is a takeaway of messages that I gathered. So first of all, well, the physics-informed parameters that we derive from the induced seismicity and also from the hydraulic data provide a pretty complete picture of damage and stress evolution in the reservoir or in the fault zone, as well as the information on energy partitioning, and that effectively enable us to identify a potential transition from stable deformation to a critical state using machine learning. We strongly believe that the evolution of the seismic energy that is observed during injection or any, let's say, suspicious trends in the seismic energy evolution that are deviating from that predicted by existing models of the maximum magnitude, for example, should be considered seriously, and they should trigger the reassessment of injection operations. These 2 studies, one on reservoir scale and the laboratory scale, both highlight that it's actually quite important to investigate the fault zone structural and stress complexity and its evolution in basically defining our constraints on forecasting capabilities of runaway earthquake and also on estimation of seismic hazard. And finally, the laboratory studies suggest that it is actually really important to have a deeper look into the spatiotemporal analysis, spatiotemporal evolution of the small earthquakes and their collective behavior in, well, basically identifying the critical state of the reservoir, well, and maybe hopefully forecasting a critical state of the reservoir. So this is actually conforming with the meta-analysis of Arnaud Mignon on the informative foreshocks, which basically states that you really need to have a span of magnitude observations to get the information on that something is going on. And it also emphasizes that importance of high frequency monitoring and also application of machine learning techniques to enhance the catalog. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to hear questions. And once again, if you are interested, you can scan the QR code for the full literature on the ST1, also was from the friends from Helsinki. And so that's all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Grzegorz. This was a very complex presentation with a lot of information. Is it possible to share the presentation? But I would say also if you can add at the end the references, the full references. There are a lot of papers here.
Yes, that is possible.
Yes, thank you very much. I will stop the recording now.